So hello everybody, I am Gaetan Launay and I am postdoc at Laurentian University. So I am in charge of the research activity on the Rainy River Transect and also in charge of the geological interpretation of the Timmins geophysical dataset. So my presentation of today is focused on the geophysical signatures and crustal architecture of variably endowed greenstone belt. So basically, I will show some results from Rainy River and Timmins and compare these two areas. So I will just turn on the pointer. Okay. So today we'll discuss about these two areas, the Rainy River Transect, which is located in the Wabigoon subprovince, and the Timmins and Matheson area, located in the Abitibi subprovince. So despite lots of similarities in terms of surface geology, because in the two subprovinces we are in typical granite greenstone belt terrains, there are lots of differences in terms of gold endowment, with about 70 millions of ounces of gold just for the Timmins camp, while the total reserve of gold for the Western Wabigoon is about 10 million ounces. So there is a big gap between these two subprovinces, and the question is why. So basically, to try to elucidate the factors that contribute to the variable endowment between the greenstone belts, we have to investigate the crust and the crustal architecture at depth. This also implies to investigate the difference of fault geometry between these different areas and compile the surface geology with the geophysical data sets. And a question which is related to this work is to determine if the world-class deposits like the Timmins area are related or not to specific geophysical signatures. So today, the presentation is focused on the comparison between these two areas. So let's start with the Rainy River Greenstone Belt. So the Rainy River Transect is located just right here in the westernmost part of the Western Wabigoon subprovince. So the Western Wabigoon subprovince is limited to the north by the Mesoarchean Winnipeg River terrain, to the southeast by the Mesoarchean Marmion terrain, and to the south by the sedimentary Quetico subprovince. So basically, the Western Wabigoon is a typical granite greenstone subprovince with a large and complex intrusive TTG intrusions surrounded by greenstone belt. Here you have the Rainy River Greenstone Belt, which hosts the only one active gold mine of the entire Western Wabigoon. At the regional scale, we can observe different crustal scale deformation zone, like the Wabigoon deformation zone here, the Manitou Dinarwick here, the Camel Neck Pipestone deformation zone, and to the south, the Quetico deformation zone, which is a very important structure for the Wabigoon, because this fault defined sigmoidal shaped transpressive domains that mark the boundary between the Wabigoon and the Quetico. So here you have the transpressive domain, which was probably formed during the convergence between the Wawa and the Western Wabigoon. So here it's the detailed geological map for the Rainy River area. So basically, the Rainy River Greenstone Belt from a homoclinal sequence facing to the southeast, and which occur between the Sabaskong batholite and the Rainy Lake batholite. In the both case, we have a gneissic dome. Here it's the Ash Bay Dome, and here the Morson Bay Dome, for which we found some inherited zircons about 2830. But basically, the most representative age for the formation of the Greenstone Belt is around 2720, 2716, which is the age of the volcanism which occur in this Greenstone Belt and also in the entire Wabigoon subprovince. In terms of structures, we have here the Camel Neck deformation zones, the Helena Pipestone deformation zones, and to the south, the Quetico deformation zones, which form the boundary between the Rainy River Greenstone Belt and this sedimentary basin. So in terms of stratigraphy, we have a lower mafic unit and an upper felsic unit of calcareous composition, which is related to the thin volcanic Rainy River gold mineralization. On the top of that, we have marine sedimentary sequence, which correspond basically to the Porcupine sedimentary basin that you can observe in the Abitibi And on some localities, we can find some Seine River group, which is an equivalent of the Timmins-Camang, but this sedimentary group doesn't exist in the Rainy River Greenstone belt. The red line just right here corresponds to the R1 seismic profile acquired by metallers, while the blue one corresponds to the high resolution R2 lines. So here it's the seismic profile, the R1 seismic profile. So based on the interpretation of this seismic profile, we can distinguish three different crustal domains. An upper crust, which is characterized by a weak reflectivity. We can observe some reflectors which dip to the south in the northern part of the greenstone belt and which dips to the north in the southern part. So basically we have a large-scale syncline. This upper domain is demarcated at depth along this dashed line, which extends up to 9 kilometers. Under this first domain, we have the middle crust domain, which is highly reflective and occur between 9 and 15 kilometers, basically. We have some less reflective zones, which seems to correspond to intrusions in this part. And basically, we interpret this mid-crust as an icy crust intruded by the thin volcanic TTG. And we can also observe lots of truncations of the reflectors, which allow to depict the overall geometry of the deformation zone at depth. So here we have a very nice fault which corresponds to the Quetico deformation zone, and we have some over listric faults which seems to be related to normal motion like this one. And then, so we have a third domain, which is the lower crust, and which is characterized by weak reflectivity and seems to be homogeneous. And we have basically only some horizontal reflectors. And we interpret this last domain as the lower gneissic crust. So here it's the R2 seismic profile, so which allows to investigate the upper crust. And here you have the insert of the R2 profile on the R1. So we can clearly see the reflectors that I described previously from the R1. So we have these interesting reflectors which correspond to the contact between the mafic and the felsic volcanic rocks. We have some other south dipping reflectors that correspond basically to the mafic lava flow. And you have these reflectors which correspond to the contact between this upper mafic and lower felsic volcanic rock, which correspond to a thrust actually. And here there are some reflectors which are truncated and allow to constrain the geometry of the Quetico deformation zone at depth. We can also remark that the Quetico deformation zone is related to a transparent zone that can be related to some syntectonic intrusions that in place along the Quetico deformation zone, like the Kingsford intrusions just right here. Here, it's the seismic profile with the AMT Transect. So in the big picture, we can distinguish an upper resistive crust with R1, R2, and R3 resistive anomaly, and 3 conductive anomaly. So the C1, which corresponds to the Dobby traumatic intrusions and which is related to a massive sulfides mineralization. So basically we have a nickel, copper, and PG mineralization related to these intrusions. The C2 anomaly, which seems to correspond to a gneissic crust occurring in the mid-crust. And you have this interesting C3 conductive zones, which form a dome shape and which is spatially related with the Morrison gneissic dome on the surface. So at the big picture scale, we have a typical dome and keel architecture for this greenstone belt with thrust and normal fault occurring in the syncline which forms the Rainy River greenstone belt. So now if we compare the Rainy River greenstone belt with the Matheson transect, so I have chosen to compare these two transects because in terms of surface geology, we have basically the same thing. In the both cases, we have volcanic sequence and marine sediments, so the porcupine sediments. And in the both cases, we have regional structures and crustal scale structure, the Quetico deformation zone for the Rainy River area, and the porcupine fault zone for the Matheson area. So in terms of mineralization, the Matheson is basically is characterized by the presence of gold deposits and mineralization, which is not the case for the Quetico deformation zone. So now if we compare the geometry of the fault, we can remark that the Quetico deformation zone is associated with a listric geometry, and the extension of this fault is limited for the first 10 kilometers, while for the Porcupine-Destor fault zone, we have a steep and deeply rooted fault zone that occur until 25 kilometers, which is the double that we observe in the Quetico deformation zone. Then we can compare that the Porcupine-Destor fault zone is associated with a finger-like shape of a finger-like shape conductive anomaly, which connect the conductive mid-crust with the surface, which is not the case for the Quetico deformation zone. So basically, the MT dataset here allows to visualize directly the fluid pathway, which is absent in the Quetico deformation zone. So maybe the geometry and the fact that the fault doesn't extend too deep limits the capacity of the fault to drain the fluids produced at depth during the metamorphism, while for the Porcupine deformation zones, the fault is steeply rooted and was able to drain the fluids and form gold deposits on the surface. So now I will switch to the next part of my presentation, focus on the Timmins area. So basically here it's the geological map, the regional geological map of the Abitibi Greenstone Belt. So we have 6 volcanic assemblages and 2 sedimentary assemblages. The most important structural features are the Porcupine-Destor fault zone just right here, and the Ladder Lake Cadillac fault zone that hosts the main gold deposits for the Abitibi. And the Timmins area is located just right here in the westernmost part and correspond to a complex zone with a frost and fold belt. Here is displayed the geological map for the Timmins area with the stations, the AMT stations acquired by our industrial partners. So there are in total 250 AMT stations, with 150 acquired by Newmont on the main Timmins camp. There are 59 stations acquired by Canada Nickel on the Crawford and McDermid deposits, 24 stations acquired by International Explorer in the Black River volcanic assemblage here, which is related to VMS deposits, and 18 stations acquired by Pan American Silver in the West Timmins area, which hosts also gold mineralization. So basically, based on this data set, Ademola, who did a great presentation on Monday, did the inversion with a 3D modeling. And the AMT data set allow to investigate the upper crust. So basically up to 5 kilometers. So on the left, you have the geological map with the main structures and the locations of the AMT stations and the location of the most important deposit of the Timmins camp. And on the right, it's the shallowest depth slice of the AMT dataset. So we can observe some very interesting features with a C1 anomaly, which align with the Porcupine-Destor fault zone. There are also a second anomaly, the C2 anomaly, which is located just under the Dome and Buffalo ankerite deposits. And there is a C3 anomaly located just right here. Here it's the next depth slices, so which occur between 0.5 and 0.6 kilometers. So the C1 anomaly is still present and is consistent with the geometry on the surface of the Porcupine-Destor fault zone. The C3 anomaly start to extend to the north and form a folded shape. And there is another one anomaly which starts to appear, which is a C5, and which is aligned with this thrust and go through the Oil Pond and Bell Creek trend. Here it's the next depth slice, so about 1 kilometer. The conductive anomalies are better defined, especially for the C5 anomaly, which form continuous east-west conductive zones parallel to this thrust and parallel to the Bell Creek Oil Pond trend. The C2 anomaly form a continuous folded shape here, like the C3, which go under the McIntyre and Hollinger deposits. And there is another one anomaly which starts to appear just right here, and also which is also east-west here. This is the last slice that I will show. So there is a connection between the C2 and the C4, and we can observe another one which seems to be parallel to this fault, the Benedict-Burrows fault, and the C5, C6, which is very well defined now and from clearly an east-west conductive zones like the C5 finally. So here it's the vertical slices. So here are displayed the cross-section lines, AA', BB', CC', and DD'. For the first slice, we can clearly see that there is a conductive anomaly, which dip shallowly to the north, which seems to be connected on the surface with graphite-rich layers occurring at the base of the crest formation. On the BB', there is the C2 anomaly, which is also seems to be connected on the surface with graphite-rich layers underlying the dome mine area. And we have the C5 anomaly, which is the east-west anomaly occurring here along this thrust. And you can observe that through the different cross-sections, it forms a continuous conductive zones. So to summarize, the AMT data set show that we have a very interesting conductive anomalies which are spatially related to the known mineral deposit, like the oil ponds, the Bell Creeks, the Hollinger, and the Dome area. There are some very interesting east-west and large conductive zones which go through the oil pond Bell Creek mine trend, and another one, potential interesting area to the north. And the Dome and the Hollinger deposits seems to be related to folded conductive anomalies that are shallow and not deeply rooted compared to the Oil Pond and Bell Creek anomaly. So now I will discuss about where we are now for this project, for the interpretation of the AMT. So basically for the future, we are trying to identify the potential causes of the conductive anomalies. So in these diagrams are displayed the resistivity range for the different rocks and minerals. So basically the most conductive minerals are massive sulfides, graphite, and some mafic rock related to some alterations. So on these three maps, I have displayed different hypotheses. For this one, it's the surface projection of the veins area related to graphite pyrite alteration that you can observe in the Timmins camp, especially in the oil pond area. And we can see that there is a good spatial relationship between the surface projected area of alteration and veins and the conductive anomaly, especially for the oil pond, the C4 anomaly, for the dome area, and for the McIntyre area as well. In this second map, it's the graphite-rich layer, which is displayed. And again, we have a good correlation between the oil pond and the C4 conductive anomaly. The folded shape of this anomaly seems to be consistent with the folded shape of the graphite-rich layer on the surface, like this one as well. And on this final map, it's the altered ultramafic rocks. So basically serpentinized ultramafic rocks that can be also a potential cause of conductive anomaly due to the formation of magnetite during the serpentinization. So it seems to work for the ultramafic comatiite occurring along the Porcupine-Dester Fault zone here. So for the future, we will collect some samples in drill cores at different locations in the Timmins mining camp to do some petrophysical measurements and address in detail this topic. So now I will switch to the presentation of the AMT dataset. So metalers pay for the acquisition of AMT stations along the seismic discover ABTB transects. There are 80 AMT stations. The data quality is good across the region, And the inversion allows to investigate the full crustal geology up to 36 kilometers in this case. So basically, we'll try to determine if the conductive anomaly that we observe on the AMT are connected with deeper structure in the AMT dataset. So here are displayed some depth slices. So the shallowest is here, and here is the deepest. We can identify some very interesting conductive features, especially the C7 and the C3, which are basically the same that we observe in the AMT station and from east-west trending line along the main structures. The C5B and A are also interesting because they seem to be parallel to these deformation zones, and they also seem to be parallel to ultramafic rocks occurring in this area. And these ultramafic rocks can be related to nickel deposit like the Crawford deposit in this area. So with depth, the C5B and C5A anomalies start to be better defined and form a continuous conductive zones which form a northwest-southeast trending line. And the C7 and C3 are still present at depth. That seems to that indicates that the conductive anomaly observed along the Oil Pond, Bell Creek, and the Porcupine Destorfall zone are deeply rooted. So now we will switch to vertical view. So here are displayed the cross-section lines. So the most important thing that we can observe first, it's we have two domains, an upper resistive crust and a conductive mid-lower crust. And this conductive mid-lower crust is characterized by lots of topography and is clearly disturbed compared to the other AMT transect of metal earth. There are lots of fingers and conductive anomalies that rise to the surface, especially here in the Porcupine Destorfall zone and under the Pipestone deformation zone here. On the second sections, we can clearly see the conductive anomalies, which are connected on the surface with known deposits, which is very interesting. Here, it's the next two vertical slices, the C' and DD'. This one is particularly impressive because we can clearly observe that the conductive anomalies observed on the AMT are connected with a deep conductive crust. So basically, we have a conductive corridor which connects the mid-lower crust to the surface where we found the gold deposits. So maybe we are looking the fossilized fluid pathway which forms the deposits on the surface in the Timmins mining camp, and the conductivity can be related to graphite-rich by CO2-rich fluids that deposit some graphite and pyrite along the deformation zones before to form the deposits on the surface. On the last vertical slice, we can see that there is a connection between the C7 anomaly, which occur along the Porcupine Destorfall zone, and the C5A anomaly, which occur along this fault. So basically, we have a very great connection between the lower conductive crust and the upper crust, and some anomalies are connected with each other. So to summarize, we have a resistive upper crust and a conductive mid-lower crust, like we observe in all of the other transect of metal earth. But there is a big difference for the Timmins camp. It's the topography of the conductive mid-lower crust. There are several subvertical conductive corridors which connect the mid-lower crust to the surface, just where we observe the known deposit on the surface, especially along the Porcupine Destorfall zone and the splay of this deformation zone. The anomalies that you observe on the AMT seems to be connected with deep structures. And there is some interesting features in the northern part of the transect, especially here. We have a clear northwest southeast conductive zones, which can be related to a boundary between the north and the south Abitibi greenstone belt, or a deformation zone, or to the ultramafic intrusions occurring in this area. it's something that we have to address for the future. And basically, we can demonstrate based on the AMT data set that the deposits occurring in the Timmins area are connected with a deep-seated hydrothermal system, like Rasmus demonstrates for Matheson. And finally, if there is an important message, it's that the Timmins area is characterized by an exceptional geophysical signature for the AMT dataset. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks very much, Gaetan. We have time for a question. Graham, you're quick with your hand.
Yeah, well, very interesting. And of course, when I think of deep structures, I think a little bit deeper than the lower crust. So I'm wondering whether there's any longer period data that allows you to see how deep those anomalies go. And the reason I ask is that there's a number of studies now that have been published, like the Olympic Dam study, and then there's two studies that I'm involved with students with Martin Unsworth in the Slave and the Sass Craton, where we can see these anomalies going right through the lithospheric mantle, actually. So, and that's what I would call a deeper structure. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you can access to the upper mantle part from the AMT dataset that we have. It's something that I have to discuss with Ademola, who is the geophysicist in charge of the inversion of the dataset. But yeah, of course, it could be something very important to do to determine if it's connected in the mantle, like it was done for the Olympic Dam.
Yeah, very interesting then.
Any other questions? All right, well, thanks very much, Gaetan. That was a great talk.